Hey, welcome to the Breakaway Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the talks and stick around for more at the end.
Well, tonight we're going to talk about something that is probably the most consistent topic of conversation when students come to visit with me. But oddly enough, it's an issue that I've never heard a sermon preached on. And it's the issue of friendship. So I'll get a young believer, a young person will come to me that just became a Christian. And they'll come to me and they'll say, without even really trying much at first, I've begun to look different from my friends, and it's created some tension in me, and I'm starting to wonder, do I need to, because of this new allegiance, leave my friendship groups? Do I ditch my buddies? Do I find a new Christian set? Because the truth is, it's hard to have the treasure of my heart not be valued by my current social structure. And honestly, it gets old, being the only sober guy at the party. And so do I leave? And there's this tension of, should I stay out of a sense of mission, or do I go and just kind of link up with a whole new group of Christian friends? Or on the flip side, I'll talk to somebody who, and particularly at this school, it's very possible to look up your sophomore year, junior year as a Christian and look around and realize you don't have a non-Christian friend. And you look around and go, I really don't know any non-Christian people well. And the truth is, it's become very natural for me to start speaking in a way where I could say sentences like, oh yeah, I was talking with my discipler the other day about my walk, and I think everyone would know what I'm talking about. And it would confuse me if someone heard me use those words and go, what? Because most people don't talk that way, right? And so some of us look up after a couple of years and go, I don't have any non-Christian friends. And so you go, so what do I do? Do I need to start hanging out at the clubs? Do I need to kind of move away from this crowd and move into this one? And so we feel this tension from either side. Where is the Christian supposed to go? Should we be out grinding in the clubs, or should we jump into a Christian compound and never come out and just throw loose change and gospel tracts over the wall every now and again to those pagans out there, right? And so what are we supposed to do? And that's a bit of a joke, but I'm being honest. A lot of us feel that tension. What's the balance here? And how do I strike it? Am I doing it well? And I get a lot of people ask me that. They feel a great degree of stress about that. How does this work? If I have this allegiance with Christ, and the reality is, an allegiance with Him does change things. When you get married, that new bond of relationship impacts every area of your life: family, finances, friendship. And when you start a new bond with God by faith, that impacts every area of your life, including friendship. Now the question is, how? In what way? And what does it mean for me as a believer to navigate in a world where maybe that same allegiance isn't held by most people? And so how do we navigate? Well, what's interesting is, again, Abram is constantly offered up to us in the Bible as a model of walking by faith. And so we're going to look at him tonight, and he's going to be a model of how to do it right. Now, last week we saw him, and he was a model of what not to do. He did not have faith in God in a moment of panic, and he made some bad calls. We're skipping chapter 13, and it's sad because it's a beautiful chapter. But you see in chapter 13, Abram does, in the midst of some stress financially and with his property and his family's future, he decides to trust God with his life rather than panic, and God blesses him for it. And so now as we come to this chapter, he's right on the heels of having made some good decisions as a man who walks by faith. And we're going to watch him walk into some social spheres, and we're going to see how Abram does. And he's going to be a picture for us of how we, as people who have an allegiance to God as our King, walk in the midst of a world where maybe that same allegiance isn't shared. Now, the reality is, I say that, now some of you, what I'm about to say is going to be groundbreaking to you, and it's going to challenge you. Some of you already feel like you know where I'm going. You're like, I know what this is about. And so if you feel like I've already got the biblical concepts of my social dynamics and what they're supposed to look like, I want to challenge you. Don't just click off because you know, but evaluate your own personal life at present based on what we're about to look at. And then there's a third group in this room that you don't necessarily have any sort of allegiance to Jesus Christ or would even identify yourself as such. And so some of this will be kind of like listening in on a family meeting, but hang in there because I have something very specific I want to say to you at the end. So with that said, when we jump into this context, the first 10 verses are all just laying out where we are. And the scene it sets is a scene that's war. And so you see in the first 2 verses, it just gives you that summary. It says there were 4 kings, and they seem to be led, as the passage develops, by a guy named Chedorlaomer. which I always thought sounded like a Pokemon character. I don't know about you, but it just does to me. I choose you, Chedorlaomer. All right, but and it says, in the days, and then names these kings. So you get the sense that these are pretty significant men, that the time is designated by the time of their existence and their rule. So these are 4 significant kings, and they go to war against these 5 kings, the most prominent of which are the king of Sodom and king of Gomorrah. And then as the rest of the verses work out, you see kind of what happened. These 5 kings of the south, led probably by the king of Sodom, they were somehow under the control of Chedorlaomer. And so they were under his domination for the better or more than a decade. Until finally these 5 kings gathered together in the valley of Siddim, and they said, we've had enough, and they formed a coalition and they rebelled. And so Chedorlaomer did what you expect. He gathered his allies and he marches off to war to teach them a lesson. And then as the passage moves on, you get this sense in verses 5 through 7. It starts talking about him moving towards them. And it's supposed to intimidate you that Chedorlaomer and his forces are like a massive wave crushing everything in its wake. That he beats the Rephaim and the Zuzim and the Amalekites and Amorites. You see him annihilate 6 kingdoms as he's moving towards this valley. And so by the time he gets to this valley, it renames all the kings again, which does sound kind of funny. You're like, why do you keep telling us their names? But the reality is the word king is going to show up 20 times. And they were doing that because it's meant to jump out at you. I'm talking about kings. These are kings. It's meant to show you, hey, what's happening here is epic. It's huge. The 5 kings against the 4, the kings of the north versus the kings of the south. This is the battle of the 9 kings, and it's coming. And so they clash. Chedorlaomer's 4 and the Sodom 5. And how does it turn out? Not good for Sodom. I mean, they get their rears handed to them, and the way the author shows it to us is it just points out this detail. They get beat so bad, they start to run away, and as they're running, they're falling into tar pits, and so they're a mess, all right? And then Cheddar and his boys do what you would expect them to do. It says they took all their goods, all their food, supplies, and departed. So to the victor goes the spoils. They took their stuff and bailed. But then where our story picks up, where it's significant, is in verse 12. It says they also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed. And here's where our first point is. One, you go, who's Lot? Well, we met him last week, and this text tells us he's Abram's nephew. But what's interesting is the New Testament in 2 Peter chapter 2 calls him righteous Lot. Now, in the Bible, there's only one way to be righteous. Righteous is a relational term. It means to be right with God, in a right relationship with him. And Habakkuk says it most succinctly. It's quoted 3 times in the New Testament. He says, the righteous are those who live by faith. That I believe God and what he's doing in his plan in the universe. And as I do that, God declares me to be right with him. And so Lot is a believer. And so here, Lot is this believer. And when Chedorlaomer and his people wipe out these 5 kings, including Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot gets swept up in the tide. And you go, how did that happen? Well, the passage tells us the reason. It says, for the reason Lot got swept up, even though he's not even a king, it says, for he was living in Sodom. Now, how did that happen? Well, last week we saw in a moment of panic, Abram and Lot went down into Egypt. They were deceptive in Egypt, and their deception seemed to work because they got a bunch of livestock out of the deal. But then what we didn't look at was in chapter 13, the fact that they have all this livestock starts meaning they have too much for the land to support, and Abram's men and Lot's men begin to fight, thus proving the old adage spoken by the prophet P. Diddy, the more money you come across, the more problems you see, right? And so these guys get a bunch of stuff. I'm sorry, I know it's lame, but I had to say it. But they get into a war, and their abundance drives their family apart. It's actually very sad. And you see Lot, Abram defers to Lot. He says, Lot, you go wherever you want to go, and I'll go the other way. And Lot shows some true colors. He's a selfish man. And so he looks over at the land he thinks is best, and he takes it. And he moves up, and the text ends by saying, and he chose the land with Sodom in it. And then it tells us, and he camps near Sodom. And then the next thing it says is, now Sodom was wicked exceedingly. And so in chapter 13, you see Lot just goes for his, whatever's to his advantage, even though it puts him in proximity with some pretty evil people. But it says that he moved his camp near it. He's still in the tents. But what we find out in this chapter is he's kept sliding that way. And so the reason he gets swept up with the Sodomites is because he had moved into the town with these exceedingly wicked people. And so you see Lot is a believer, but he's chosen to make his closest association. He lives among the Sodomites. And so when they get hammered, so does he. When they face judgment, so does he. And so the same trouble that hits the pagan hits him. Now, does this happen to people? all the time. I mean, how many of you have friends that that's happened to? They're a believer in Jesus, but they've chosen to make their predominant social sphere a group of people who don't have an allegiance with God in mind. And so when this group makes a bad decision, they pay for it too. And so you see someone who says, hey, I didn't do anything wrong, but you were in the wrong place, wrong time with the wrong people, and you reap the repercussions, right? See, Lot is a representative of a believer who decides to make his closest social sphere those who don't share that same allegiance. And so when they get punished, so does he. Lot is a great case for us for separation, that there should be some division. Because if you're a believer and you make your closest social sphere people who don't have that same allegiance, some things are going to go bad for you. And namely, 4 things quickly. Number 1 is you're going to reap what they sow. You're going to reap what they sow. If you decide to link up with some pretty rowdy people, those associations will bring repercussions, right? They will. I remember I had a buddy that went out to a bar with a group of his friends, believing guy, wonderful guy, went out with some pretty rowdy friends. One of his buddy picked a fight with a dude who was a lot more than he could handle and had a bunch of friends who were also huge. And so not only did he get his rear kicked, so did everyone in their party, all right? And so my Christian friend got beat up. Why? Because he was in a bad place at a bad time with the wrong guys. And he was like, I didn't do anything. Yeah, all right, man. But hey, you were in the blast radius, all right? You're not a victim. I don't know if you've seen the movie Lonesome Dove. If you've not, as a Texan, you need to repent and then go see it. And there's a character in there that perfectly embodies this, Jake Spoon. Everybody loves Jake Spoon. He's a nice guy, a good guy, was a Texas Ranger. And yet Jake was a guy who's always trying to go for his own advantage, and it doesn't matter who he sells out socially. And so he ends up riding around with a pretty rowdy group, and he's not courageous enough to back away when they start moving further and further into some pretty bad stuff. And so finally, he's riding with these guys, and they murder people. And so he gets to a point where he gets hung by his friends. And so he looks at them with a noose around his neck, and he's trying to plead for forgiveness. And then he gets a famous line from the movie. They tell him, they look in Jake's eyes, and they say, hey, Jake, you ride with an outlaw, you die with an outlaw. The fact that you didn't say that immediately breaks my heart. Say, hey, you ride with him, you die with him. And so it says, hey, you're going to reap what they sow. Another thing that's going to happen, if you're a believer and say, hey, all my closest social connections are people who don't share this allegiance, the reality is you're going to adopt their ways. You'll look like them. I mean, we see this in very natural ways, right? You live with your roommates. What happens after a year living with your roommates? You start to laugh the same, you say the same quotes and the same jokes, and then you get to that moment where you start fighting over who came up with that. You say something and they go, that's what I always say. And you go, what? You totally got that from me. And they're like, no, I didn't. You got it from me. And you're like, what? I always say that. And you go, you always say it because I always say it. No. And you can't remember where the one began and the other ended, right? That happens. And so the book of Proverbs says this. 1 Corinthians says this. Do not be deceived. Bad company, it corrupts good morals. It says, hey, don't be silly about this. You're going to hang out with a rough crowd and think you're not going to be like them? You seriously think that's going to run that way? It's not. And if you don't regress, often you don't move forward. And I saw this a lot in my own personal career in college. I had buddies who, they got into college, were Christians, but they made their tightest inner circle people who didn't have any allegiance for the Lord, but they made a commitment when they did it that they weren't going to drink. And so I saw them 2 or 3 years later, and as a believer, they weren't serving the poor, discipling people, ministering to the lost, being used in any kind of productive way. But they had managed to not drink. And you're like, well, that's great, but there's more to it than that. And so if all you're doing is maintaining a couple moral imperatives, you're meant to progress. And the last thing is, I think, personally, you end up having less of an impact than the believer who has some distance. We're going to watch Abram make a greater difference in the pagan community in this area than Lot does, even though Lot lives right next to them the whole time. Abram has a sense of distance, and he's going to have a stronger impact. I remember for me in college, my freshman year, I was in a position where I was about to join a fraternity. And I don't think fraternities are evil, and I'm not knocking them. But I had kind of saddled up close to one that were cool guys, but they were a pretty kind of hard partying group. And I was at a place where I knew I wasn't going to get drunk. But I had a lot of doubts about my faith and struggles. And I had just kind of found myself where I was about half a step away from being in this deal. And I looked around and I said, you know what? I could manage to maintain a couple moral convictions here, but I'm not going to grow and I'm not going to make a difference. I'm just not. And I knew myself well enough to know I personally am not in a place where I could be a positive influence in this place. And so I just told him, I'm sorry, I can't do this. I ended up finding some good Christian community. And I'll tell you, by my senior year, God had grown me a lot in my faith. In my senior year, I became friends with two fraternity guys. We're in a fraternity together, and they had joined up. They were strong Christian guys who were making a difference in their fraternity and were supporting one another. And I remember they came to me because at that time I was leading Bible studies on campus. And they said, hey, we want to start a Bible study to the Greek community. Will you help us form it? We want to run it. We don't want you to take it over, but we want you to help us form it. And I said, yes. And so I got to be a part of having an impact on the Greek community as a senior, as not being somebody in a fraternity. And I laughed at that because I thought, if I would have jumped in here knowing who I was at that time, I wouldn't have made much of an impact. But here, after some years of maturation, God is using me. And I think that's what you're going to see. Abram is going to be pretty productive. Lot is not. All right. So what's the principle? And then we'll move on. 2 Corinthians 6:14 says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? And we typically talk about that with dating or marriage. All right. But it's talking about yoking is when you put two animals in the same deal and they move the same direction. And he's talking about believers, unbelievers. He says, don't be yoked up that you are bound together through the rest of life with somebody who isn't chasing the same king as you. It's not going to go well for you. And so believer, if your only social sphere, if your closest social sphere are people who don't have the same allegiance to your king, it's going to limit you in some ways. Okay? And it can be a dangerous place for you to live. So who are your closest associations? Now, some of you hear this and you feel some tension with this. You go, hey, dude, what are you saying? Are you saying I'm supposed to leave here and just join all Christian friends? That I just gather around in a circle, turn our backs to the world and sing Kumbaya, my Lord, and wait for the rapture? Like, is that what you're talking about? Us to become some odd little clique? Well, no. And again, I said Abram's our model, not Lot. Now look at Abram in verse 13. It says, then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew what happened to Lot. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and those were allies with Abram. I want you to look at two things. Number one, look at his location. It says he is by, not in. And you go, is that just a little point you're pulling out? No, because as you look through all of Abram's journey, the author will always point out that Abram stayed in a tent. In some sense, he lived as a stranger and an alien in the land. He kept that sense of distinctiveness. And what's interesting is the New Testament will pick up on that language and will call us that. 1 Peter will say to God's elect, strangers in the world. And then we'll base our behavior on that in 1 Peter 2. It says, as aliens and as strangers, abstain from some behaviors that the rest of the world's in. So the Bible will advocate the believer is supposed to have a sense of distance. You're supposed to be a little bit different. You're supposed to have some distinctives to you that might even get you branded as stranger, right? One of our earliest Christian writers after the New Testament wrote this. He says, we have a reputation of being aloof from the crowds, that there's something different about us. And yet, you go, okay, so did Abram just pull away? Well, no, because look at the rest of it. It says he was living by the oaks of Mamre, who's a guy, and he's got a brother named Eshcol and a brother named Aner. And it says, and they were allies with Abram. Do you see that? So these guys are Amorites. And the text points out, Abram the Hebrew, Mamre the Amorite, they're not from the same tribe. They're not running with the same convictions. And yet Abram keeps a sense of distance, and yet he connects too, to the degree that he calls them ally. That you see Abram strikes this balance where he's sort of in their world, but not of their world, is the way you could say it. That he lives by them. There's an association with a healthy sense of separation. And you see, that's the biblical model. You see it with Jesus. John chapter 2 is talking about Jesus. It says, when he was in Jerusalem, many believed in his name, observing his miracles. But Jesus, on his part, was not entrusting himself to them because he knew what was in men. So you see that all these people wanted to believe in Jesus and sort of be his friends, but he realized some of these guys, their motives aren't right. And so Jesus in John chapter 2 keeps a sense of separation. And yet when you get to Luke chapter 7, the religious crowd, when they look at Jesus, they call him a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So one group is saying, hey, Jesus kept some separation. Another saying, yeah, but he was friends with these guys. He did hang out with a non-believing crowd all the time. And so it's interesting. I have people say that. They'll read that verse about how Jesus was a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And they go, see, that's why I should be out there in a bar every night, because someone's got to be a light out there. And I remember I had a friend like that in college. He was the one lone, sober Christian sitting in the corner. And I thought, that's great, man. But after 2 or 3 years of it, what fruit have you seen? What fruit have you seen from that? Right? Now, I'm not saying a Christian can't go to a bar. Go to a bar. I'm not saying a Christian can't drink. I don't care if you do. But I'm saying there's people that jump in there sometimes and they go, you know what, I'm going to be the light in a dark world in this bar. And I got to tell you, I did that for a little while, and I had these powerful spiritual conversations that they didn't remember the next morning, all right, when they were sober. And I just realized this is much more productive at lunch when you're sober. It all makes more sense, and you remember it. And so the reality is there a degree of separation? Yeah, but did Jesus hang out with non-believing people? Yes. He'll hang out with a religious guy who doesn't believe him in John chapter 2. He'll sit and talk with and be gracious to a promiscuous woman who's very skeptical about Jesus' whole scene. He'll go to Matthew's house when Matthew's having a party with sinners. He'll walk in there and have no problem with it. Jesus will hang out with a crazy, naked, demon-possessed guy. Jesus would hang out with anybody, all right? And so should you as a Christian. You should be willing to sit and have coffee with and build a relationship and be friends with everybody, anybody who's open to do that with you. And yet, when Jesus went home at night, and he didn't have a home, but when he went back to where he was camping, who was he laying next to? Who were the guys with him every day? Who were his tightest inner circle? It was the 12. And he would pull off sometimes just to teach them. And he would walk with them. They saw him when he was his weakest. They saw him in his prayer life. They were the closest, intimate group. Jesus kept a circle around him of people who had the same allegiance to his king. Were they perfect? Not by a long shot. But his inner circle were people who loved his God. And then with that circle, he launched out into an unbelieving world. Paul did the same thing. The Apostle Paul traveled all over the pagan world. He was making friends with anybody. The reason he would go to towns was to make friends with people who didn't have the same allegiance with Jesus. He was constantly striking up conversations, meeting people, interacting with people who don't know Jesus, which is a convicting question for many of us. Do you ever do that? Do you have any friends who don't love your Lord if you're a believer? Paul was constantly making those. And yet when you look at Paul's closest, intimate, personal relationships, who traveled with him? Barnabas, who was his mentor. Luke, who was his trusted friend. Timothy, who was his disciple. When he had to stay somewhere, where did he stay? With Philemon, my fellow worker. Prepare a bed for me, right? And so you see, that's kind of the rhythm. I know for me, here at A&M, when I was a student, I kind of lived in a pretty wild world my first couple of years, had a great time, made some great friends, don't regret a lot of the decisions I made as trying to be a light in some different areas and having friends who didn't love my God. But then I started to make some Christian friends. And I remember by my junior year, I had some deep Christian relationships that were helping me grow as a person. Which incidentally, if you're not in a small group or don't have some people you gather with to study the Word of God and encourage each other, we have a Connect team for that very purpose. I beg you, do that. That's how you grow. It's as we spur one another on towards love and good deeds. But by my junior year, I looked around and I said, all I know is Christians. And I don't want to just know Christians. And so I thought, this is great. I love that you guys pray for me. I love that you hold me accountable. I love that we're studying together. But I need to go meet some people other than you. So I got a job. And I went to work at a place where they didn't give a rip what discipleship book I was reading. They didn't care what Bible verse I could quote. They'd be like, okay. The things that would impress a Christian crowd didn't impress them, all right? Hey, I met, Shane Bernard. And they're like, great, who's that? Is he a banker? I mean, they don't care, all right? But they care if you're nice to them. And you might be the one Christian representative in their life. And I worked at a cafe where there was about 2 or 3 of us that we were the Christian people there and known as such. And the way we acted was the picture of Jesus to a lot of people. I joined a club on campus. It was a business organization. I knew I wasn't even going to go into business. I went in that to meet some people who loved money. Just to see what they were like. To hang out with them. And I decided I just want to see what it's like for me to walk in your world and see if I can thrive in your world but not love the world, but love you. And I got to tell you, I got to ask you, believer, do you have that? Right? Abram has this wonderful balance. He's staying with his camp, and yet he launches out and he makes allies with some lost dudes. Now, real quickly, and we're going to do half of what I have left. But anyway, what do you do So what am I advocating? Let me say this. I'm advocating you get some close Christian friends who love you deeply, and you walk with them for a lifetime. If you don't have them, you go, how do I do that, Ben? Just jump into a small group. Just try it. Go to a church that you know is not a cult, and just sign up for one. You may be in that small group for one semester, and that's fine. My first year in college, I just joined a Bible study, and I was like, I don't know. And everything we learned in there was a review of all I did in high school. I don't remember a single lesson, but I made 2 friends that I still have today, and one of them walked with me through some very dark times in my life. You may walk out with one friend, and it's worth it. It's worth it. So you jump into that. But then as a believer, as you're beginning to grow in this culture, don't forget about everyone else on the globe, and get out there and make some allies. And so what do you do with, let's say you got your little crew, and you see one of your little believing crew go leaping headlong into depravity? What happens when you have a best friend? And a lot of you come to me with this. What happens when you got a girlfriend? She starts dating a guy who's not a Christian, and then she doesn't return your phone calls, and you don't know where she's spending her nights. Or you got a buddy that was starting to grow with you, and you've never seen him again. And you know he's probably gotten back into some things that were pretty destructive. What do you do when righteous Lot's carried off with Sodom? Well, you do what Abram did. He went and got him. You go talk to him. You get out there. Now you do it with wisdom. Did Abram go alone? No. Did he just run out to the army and go, you guys give me Lot back and I'll tell you something else? Did he do that? No. He took 318 dudes, right? The book of Jude, and nobody quotes this, and I don't understand why. Jude says, beloved, build yourself up in most holy faith. And then it says, have mercy on those who are doubting. Save others, snatching them out of the fire. Have mercy on some with fear, hating even the garments polluted by the flesh. And I love that. It says, if you see someone who's doubting, you be gracious with them. If you see somebody who's out there and they have leaped into the fire, save them, but do it with a fear, not even wanting to touch the polluted garment polluted by the flesh. And he says, so you leap out there. If you see a friend who's getting into some bad stuff, you go talk to them, but you be wise about it. So I'll talk to some people that go, you know what? I want this girlfriend of mine to walk with me with the Lord, but the truth is she's always going out. And so I thought I can't let her go out alone. So I started going out with her, and then the both of us are going out. I'm like, so you thought she was out there alone in some pretty bad environments, so you leapt in with her? That's like seeing someone drowning and just diving in, and now you're both drowning. Like, that doesn't make sense. Get some friends. Throw a line together. Like, be wise about how you do it, right? I had some friends in high school that were in my Bible study, and they walked away. They went back to a partying crowd where they were getting into some drugs and just really ruining their life. And I had a buddy in our Bible study come to me and say, hey, we need to go talk to them. And I said, well, okay, maybe. And he said, no, we need to go tonight. And so we went up to their house, and I've told this story in here before. We knock on their door, and right as the first guy comes to the door, the friend who had been pushing me to go there goes, you talk, and then takes a big step backwards. And so as soon as the door opens, and there's my friend who I haven't seen in months, but I know has just walked away from everything I believe in, is looking at me in the face, and I'm like, I hate you, and hey, how are you doing? I'm just on your doorstep on a Tuesday, and I just opened my Bible, and I read to him Matthew 18. And I said, man, we were reading this verse tonight. If a brother's in sin, go and show him his fault in private. And if he listens to you, you won a brother over. I read that to him. One of the hardest things I ever did. And I said, what do you think about that? I mean, I said, I'm not trying to, I just felt like we need to come over and say, what's going on? And he sat down on his doorstep, and he started crying. And he said, what took you so long? What took you so long? And so some of us, it's good to have our community, and when someone's out there struggling, we go to them. But we do it with wisdom. We do it with wisdom. And if you can win a brother over, great. Abram gets Lot back. It's a success. And then there's this final moment that we won't get into, but it's this powerful moment where Abram, as a victor, walks into the king's valley. And he stands between 2 kings, the king of Sodom and the king of Salem, this random dude who shows up named Melchizedek. He wasn't a part of all this other deal. But Melech means king, and Tzedek means righteous. He's the king of righteousness. And he's the king of Salem, means peace. So he's the king of righteousness, he's the king of peace, and he's a priest. And you see Abram stands there between Sodom and Salem, the man of peace who ascribes to Abram's God, and the man, Sodom, who's exceedingly wicked. And Sodom offers him all the spoils of the 9 kings, all of them. Melchizedek praises the same God Abram does. And so when Abram has to decide, do I run after a group where I'll get a bunch of physical benefits, but I have to sell my soul a little bit? Because by giving stuff up, by agreeing to what Sodom was saying, and we don't have time to go into all this, but by agreeing with him, he would essentially be forming a treaty with him. That's Abram's argument later. I'm not taking any of it, because then you'll say you made me rich. We get into this relationship that I don't want to get into with you. There's a level of connection I don't want with you. You're going to see later he will pray for Sodom. It's not that he doesn't care, but he says, I'm not going to knit my life together with yours. You're too dangerous. And yet I'll stand here in this valley and talk with you, and I will proclaim the name of my God to you. And he does it. And yet when it comes time to choose who he will unite himself with, he chooses Salem, not Sodom. And that's what we're called to do. Say, I'm going to draw up close to a believing community, and then we will launch out to make a difference together. And you will see Abram intercede for Sodom, and you'll see him do some pretty marvelous things as we move on. Last thing, to the non-believing community. It's interesting, this guy Melchizedek, he shows up and you get a lot of questions. Where did he come from? King of what? King and priest. And he starts praising the same God Abram praises, and then Abram gives him a tenth of everything he owns, and then he leaves and never comes back. And you're like, oh, okay. But then in Psalm 110, the psalm that's the quoted most in the New Testament of all psalms about the Messiah, it quotes that it says, the Messiah will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And the book of Hebrews says, a priest is one who offers gifts and sacrifices for the sins of the people. A priest is the one who sets up and says, I'm going to stand before a holy God on behalf of sinful people, and I will connect the two. I will be the conduit through which you connect. And the book of Hebrews will say it is Jesus who was declared by God in Psalm 110 to be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Therefore he is able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And so Melchizedek is an Old Testament picture of Jesus. He's a king who steps forward and says, I'm a king, I rule. I'm a king who is right before God, I'm righteous. And I'm a king who brings peace. I bless the Most High God, and that's the other reason you get the word king so much. Kings, 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 yeah, but there's one God who is Most High. And I'm going to bless you in his name. And as you come to me, you're blessed. And so he's a picture of what Jesus does for us. That Jesus comes as a priest, the one mediator between God and man. He comes as the only one who is righteous and the one who can bring us peace. And he did not offer some other sacrifice for sin. He offered himself for our sin. That he took all the punishment before God of our sin upon himself. That he could be a priest forever for us. That whoever trusts in Jesus, the one true Melchizedekian priest, then you are right before God. And so before you start figuring out who my friends are around me, that's the friendship you got to get right first. Do I know Jesus Christ? He's the rescuer of my soul. You get that one right. And then in due time, he'll build a little community around you. And then you guys, you'll change the world.
Well, hey, everybody. Thank you for being here. And Ben, we had a really, really good night, and we were back in Reed Arena, which is kind of like home for us. It feels like home. And we're excited because we're going to be there like probably 10 more times after last night. And we kicked off the night by showing a new video that we developed just kind of for the purpose of highlighting what happens on mainly Tuesday nights and what we kind of are about on those moments, but more so just for people to be able to kind of understand and see visually how many students are coming to Breakaway now, and then kind of the level of like work it takes to kind of pull that off, and then honestly just wanting people to know that we are all about worshiping and giving God glory for everything he's doing, kind of in a little 3-minute kind of video. And you were even saying last night, you've got some buddies who were like, what is going on in College Station?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it really, it's been an interesting journey the last couple of years of just being here. And, for me, really the decision to come, a lot of it was just looking around and going, this isn't just a thing we're doing and it's about Jesus. Like, when I would visit, I thought this is a very unique and special thing God is doing at A&M, and I want to be a part of that. I would feel blessed to be a part of that. And every year it's been even more people coming, more stories of students' lives being changed, more volunteers jumping on board to serve. And it's just been this beautiful, fascinating, wonderful thing that most of the world won't see because it's Tuesday night at 9:00. And so even most of our donors or people who give have never been. Well, I can't say most, but a lot. And we had a couple come, but, it's a late night, man, if you got work on Wednesday. And so we just realized we want people to share in this with us. But if you're not living in College Station, for a lot of people, that's a hard deal to do. So all last fall, we were recording just video, and finally we're starting to package it up and put it out and present it to people just to show them what's going on. And that was kind of birthed really at the request of some former students, some Aggies who heard about what God was doing, and they just said, we should know about this, communicate this to us, tell us about what's going on. And so we put together this video, and we'll have more coming. But I'm excited about it. It just gives people a picture to look at what we do. And so I hope everyone will go to our website and click on it and watch it and forward it out to their friends. And we just want everybody to celebrate what God's doing here.
Totally. Well, that's what we're going to do is we're putting it on our website. So by the time you hear this, it'll be on there, and you can go to breakawayministries.org and click on our resource section, and then there's videos right there. And you can actually, when you click on the video to watch it, once it's done playing, it'll say you want to share with a friend or whatever, and you can do that. It's pretty cool. So it's through our little Vimeo account, which I just like saying that word, Vimeo. Anyways, so please, do what Ben said. I guess just if you've got friends that you're like, hey, they need to see this, former Aggies or just friends of yours who know that would love to kind of check out Breakaway and maybe even attend. If you know students here that you have been telling you should go to Breakaway, but they're like, what's that? It's a good way to kind of give them a glimpse of what's going on. So hopefully it'll just kind of go viral.
Exactly. Exactly. That's the plan, man. Mm-hmm, yeah, exactly. So we're excited about it. And it was fun to show it last night and see students get excited about it too. So
yeah, that was very, very cool. We won't even tell you anymore. We'll just let you go watch it.
That's it.
Yeah. So dun, dun, dun. Well, then you were continuing in this Life of Abraham series, and last night it was all about friends.
Yeah,
our friends forever.
If
the Lord's the Lord of them. Some of you who were born in like 1990 will not know what we're talking about. Those of you who were born in the 70s and 80s possibly would know. It's a good Michael W. Smith hit back in the day. Mm-hmm. But even more than that, literally going a lot deeper than a song around a campfire. I mean, it's friendships are hard and they're challenging, but so worth it and vitally important to people, believers, of God.
It's interesting, man, and I didn't think of it last night. But I remember as a youth pastor, my first couple of years, did a lot of Bible study teaching with students, a lot of one-on-one meetings and stuff like that, and found that for many of them, a real pursuit of the Lord was kind of a shaky proposition, whether or not they were really going to entertain that as a serious option. And I found that by the end of my time as a youth pastor, really almost to a man and to a woman, what made the difference of am I going to walk with the Lord in high school is, do I have a community that's doing it together? You can do it by yourself for a little while, and sometimes you're going to have to for a little while. But longevity is a function of community. It's what I saw in high school. It's just if these kids could have a group supporting and encouraging one another, they're going to thrive. And without it, they're not. And so, so I just thought it was important to discuss that. Like I said, you don't hear a lot of sermons on it because you kind of know. Like, I don't know if I said anything last night that a Christian would just go, wait a second, what? Like we're supposed to hang out with Christians and non-Christians? That's insane. Like most people know that. But But what I challenged him to at the beginning was, okay, so evaluate you and how are you doing in that? Do you have close friends that are spurring you on in the faith? You know, because a lot of times you can have friends that are Christians, but y'all don't really encourage one another in the faith. You don't have conversations like Melchizedek and Abraham had. And then you get a lot of them that don't really have real fruitful relationships with non-believing friends either. And so it was more of a challenge night, I guess, than a heavy teaching night, I guess. You know, it was interesting. You know, we had a lot of students come forward to want to talk afterwards, and it wasn't, not a single one was a clarifying question. Oh, when you said that, what did you mean by? Sometimes that's, you get a lot of that. None of it was that. It was all people coming up because they were struggling deeply with a relationship of different sorts and for different reasons. But it's that very thing of, I don't have a community. I have put myself in a position where I know I'm not being a help to people, and I'm discouraged, and I'm stuck in this place. And there's so many, like, just people wrestling with how do I do healthy relationships, and so there's a lot more we could say about how to do healthy relationships. We had to kind of motor because Silver Taps, we wanted to finish to get people out, but you know, maybe we'll fill in some other time. But
for sure,
but it's a huge issue to think through. What do my relationships look like? I did want to say one thing, just because it came up a lot afterwards. I made a quick reference to, what do you do if you're a Christian and you have a Christian friend and you see their life just take maybe a hard turn into some destructive behavior, bad decisions, a bad relationship? What do you do? And I just said, just like Abram, he and Lot had a falling out the chapter before. There was some strain relationally, but when Lot was in trouble, Abram went running. And so I advocated doing that, but wisely. Some people want to go try to be the Messiah of somebody, and you can't. You can't be a savior of somebody. You can't be their Jesus, but you can go talk to them. You can go lovingly confront. And so had a lot of questions about that at the end of just like, say, how do I do that? And I just encouraged all of them. Let's say you do have a friend that you feel like you need to go talk to about their life. And I encouraged all of them. I think if you're going to confront somebody about some issue in their life that you are concerned about, I said, you really want to come humble, come in low, and share from the depths of your heart. Couch the conversation in those terms. Don't come and just go, hey man, you're doing X and you're a sinner. Like you can. And for some people that's their style and it actually really works. But I encourage them. So this isn't a one size fits all, but I encourage them, share your heart and just say, hey, I'm telling you this because I love you and because I love Jesus. And, you've articulated a similar allegiance to him that we'd both say we're his. And yet I see you doing this over here that as far as I can tell in scripture says that's stuff he expressly doesn't like, that doesn't honor him. And I just want to ask you, how do you make sense of that? And so I encourage them to couch it in terms of a question. How do you make sense of that? I remember having a conversation with a girl when I was in college who was like, yeah, I'm a Christian. And she was, sleeping with her boyfriend and living kind of a life that didn't look very distinctively Christian at all. And so I asked her, how do you reconcile that? And she said, well, I don't. I just try hard to not think about it. And, but I think it was good for her to hear herself say that. And then all I really had to say at the end was, I just don't, I don't know that I would want to live life that way. And I don't know where that landed with her, but I know that moment, at least some wheels were turning and we'll see where it goes. But, so I would just say, yeah, confront in love. It's that truth and love, both. I care about you. That's why I'm saying this, but hey, here's holiness and we're not there. And then calling them to a different life. Well, and I'll say one last thing too. It was interesting in the text we were in. I think I mentioned in the talk that the word king or kings shows up 20 times, and it's just meant to show you, I mean, you're talking about major players, world powers, and Abram is not a king. And so that comes across real clear. It makes him sound smaller. But then you see him victorious. And the passage ends with you figuring out why. Melchizedek says, blessed be Abram, but blessed be God Most High. And that's a new name to call God. He's talking about the same God. You see, Abram used the same language, and then Abram throws in Yahweh. We're talking about the same guy, same God. But you're calling him God Most High. And that leaps out because you go, all these people are kings. I'm the king of this. I'm the king of that. I'm the king of this. All these people are big and powered, whatever. And he goes, yeah, but God is the Most High. He's bigger than everybody. He possesses heaven and earth. You may possess a city, but he possesses the heavens and the earth. And Abram's going to be all right because he belongs to that God. That's the God he's praying to. That's the God who's taking care of him. And that's the God who's the basis for this really beautiful connection, friendship with Melchizedek. And so I would just encourage people, it seems like with the talk, a lot of stuff was stirred up of just some problems that feel big and some struggles that feel big and some questions of how do I do this? All this stuff that feels big. But if I could just encourage you as we go, God is the Most High. And when your life is in his hands and you walk with him, he's going to take care of you. We're watching him take care of Abram, and he'll take care of you. So trust him.
Cool, man. Well, once again, feel free to go to our website and check out the Breakaway video, and also send prayer requests to prayer@breakawayministries.org. And we're going to be in Reed Arena again next week. So for those of you who want to come on Tuesday night and join us, I'd love to see you there. And we love being at Reed, so it's good to be in that facility. And the staff's been great to work with, and just we're excited to be back there. So thanks for listening to the podcast, and we hope you have a great week, and we'll see you later.
See ya.